So here is a typical question where we can apply our knowledge of the Michaelis-Menten equation. And it basically asks us for the substrate concentration in multiples of Km that gives us an initial rate of 90% of Vmax. So how are we going to address this question? Let's write down the Michaelis-Menten equation. So that is V equals Vmax times the substrate concentration divided by Km plus the substrate concentration. And we also know that the initial rate, our V, equals 90% of Vmax. And although we don't have the values for Vmax, in this case we just simply say V equals 0.9 times Vmax, because that is what our 90% is. And now we can put that into the Michaelis-Menten equation, and we can solve this for the substrate concentration. So let's see how this works. So we've got V, and instead of V, I can write 0.9 times Vmax equals Vmax times S over Km plus S. And our Vmax cancels out. So in fact, we didn't need to know what our Vmax actually was in terms of value. And we can bring the denominator to the other side. We just multiply by the denominator and we get 0.9 times Km plus S equals S. That's what we have left on the right-hand side of the equation. Now we need to do a little bit of rearranging to solve for S. So we multiply the 0.9 into the bracket and we get 0.9 times Km plus 0.9 times S equals S. And we put everything with S to one side, everything not S to the other side. So we've got 0.9 times Km equals S minus 0.9 times S. So we can factor S out here, and we can write S times, well, S, that is same as 1 times S minus 0.9 times S. So that would be simplified, and that still gives us our 0.9 Km. And now what we need to do in order to find S is just simply divide by this term here. So we can write S equals 0.9 Km divided by this denominator by 1 minus 0.9. And that gives us 0.9 times Km divided by 0.1, or we can calculate that 0.9 divided by 0.1, that gives us 9 times Km. So at a substrate concentration that is 9 times Km, we would get 90% of Vmax. And if we want to look at that from a Michaelis-Menten plot, for example, so here we've got our substrate concentration, here we plot the rate, and we might have something like that. So what we are looking for is at which substrate concentration do we get roughly 90% of our Vmax. So if this one here, if this line here represents Vmax, we can find half of Vmax because that would be our Km. So that's roughly here. So here this point would be Km. That is half of Vmax. And we want to know at which substrate concentration do we have 90%. So 90%, that would be here 90%, roughly. That is our V. And we want to figure out what roughly is the substrate concentration that gives us this value. So we take this, the corresponding value, and this would be our S. That should be really 9 times Km, but it's perhaps with my drawing, that's not terribly good, but that should actually illustrate what this problem indicate. How we can find the substrate concentrations as a multiple of Km if we've got a given initial rate or a fraction of the initial rate in terms of Vmax. I hope this makes sense, and thank you very much for watching.